Good evening and a very warm Good evening and a very warm welcome to this masterclass, this special conversation that's planned this evening. It's titled "The Bold New Breed," and I'll shortly introduce our three special guests. But before that, you should know that this marks the culmination of a month-long masterclass experience that we stitched together around a phenomena which we believe is, and I'm sure by now you'd believe is important for us to understand and study, the gig mindset phenomena, which we're going to talk about a little later. We'd like to also welcome all of those of you who are joining us on the LinkedIn live stream. And I already see a lot of comments that are coming in. It'd be a good idea if you were to introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining from. There are lots of registrations for this session. People said they were looking forward to it. We'd love to hear from you on the chat so that the panelists know where you're joining us from, both from LinkedIn, YouTube, and the Facebook live streams. My colleague, Charles Assisi, will be anchoring the chat on LinkedIn Live. So without much ado, let me quickly introduce you to our panelists and special speakers today, starting with Ravi Venkatesan, who's joining us from Bangalore. Hi, Ravi.
Hi, Ajay. Hi, everyone.
Good to have you here. Santosh Desai joins us from Gurgaon, and both Ravi and he don't need any introductions. Most of you are familiar with them. They've appeared on some of our events, learning events before as well, and written for us. Jane McConnell joins us from the south of France. Now she's I think a familiar name with the Founding Fuel community. Love to have you. Great to have you back, Jane.
Thank you, Indrajit. It's really fun to be here.
Yes. So Jane has just recently released her gig mindset survey, which was tailored for India. And most of you would have received a copy of that report by email on Saturday. If you haven't had time to go through it, I'd urge you to do that maybe after this session is over. It's very, very interesting, some of the trends. So it essentially gives you a perspective of where India stands on the gig mindset phenomena and how it compares with the global study that Jane has done since 2018. And of course, this conversation this evening will be anchored by my colleague and our Director, Learning and Change, Kavi Arasu, who himself, of course, needs no introduction. He's done some very interesting work in the past on leadership development and learning over the years, and he's a thought leader in his own right. So before I hand over to Kavi, I can see a whole bunch of comments that are coming in from Saloni, from Ipshita, from Sudha, and Dr. Khandelwal. So lovely to have all of you join us today. And I can tell you you're going to be in for a scintillating conversation. I have no doubts about it, and I'm superbly excited. So over to Kavi.
Thank you, Ajay. Fantastic to be here. Many years ago, when I used to be following cricket quite a bit, and Jane, you'll have to excuse the introduction by way of cricket, because no conversation goes by without an introduction to cricket. So anyway, so many years ago, when I used to be following cricket quite a bit, the most important part of a game used to be the pitch report for me. When there used to be an expert, people who've been there, people who played matches many times, go in, walk into the field when nobody's around, just look at the pitch, come outside and tell the world that, the conditions are like this. And perhaps this kind of strategy would help. Maybe batsmen and bowlers should do this. This is what we're expecting. And I used to look at the pitch report every morning, and then maybe sometimes lose track of the match, but invariably go back at the end of the day and look at how have teams played vis-a-vis their pitch reports in the morning. Reading the pitch, therefore, becomes something very important for all of us because it gives us a sense of how a match needs to be played. In a sense, that's what we're going to do today. In a sense, that's what the three eminent folks in this conversation are going to do today. Each a leader in their own right. But what we've done today is two things. The first one is we've kind of said, for purposes of this conversation, can we just have you don this particular hat? So we've given them a hat, we've given them a lens and said, please look at the pitch through this angle. That's number one. Number two, we're not going to be the typical, me or Indrajit are not going to be the typical moderators or panel hosts who will come in and will ask questions to each of them. It's going to be them having a conversation amongst themselves. And of course, we're going to be there to help move the conversation along and to take questions from you and put it forward to them and stuff like that. That's going to be the way in which this conversation is going to be had. So in more than one sense, this is about reading the pitch, and the pitch is that of the world of work. Whenever we talk about work and the future of work, people usually talk about the skills associated with it or the tools that are necessary. There's a lot of talk about technology and what technology must do and will do and all of that. Very similarly, there's a lot of conversation around what kind of skills are required for the next century. But very rarely do we hear or do we talk much about what kind of mindset shifts are required for the times ahead. And if you were to combine all of what I've said so far, this is about a pitch report about the mindsets for the future. Mindsets for the future of the world of work and the world that we're going to live in. And that's why this is about an important facet of change and the ways in which the world will change even as it's spinning right now in front of us. So we're going to look at this from three broad dimensions about what are we seeing, why possibly are we seeing them, and what possibly is in store for the future. Those are the three broad segments, but we'll come to those segments later. For now, I'm going to invite Jane, who's been with us on this topic for quite a while now, for about a month now, to have her opening kickoff remarks, and then we'll take it from there. Jane?
Well, thank you, Kevin. That was a fantastic introduction to the whole session. I'll remember that pitch story and probably steal it and use it the next time it's useful for me. To introduce myself, I'm an independent consultant born in the United States years ago, and I've been living in France now for well over half my life. I'm French American. I've taken a French nationality some time ago because I've been living here for so long. So I consider myself I would say European American. I have worked as an advisor to a lot of global organizations for about 20 years. So I have a firsthand experience. I'm trying to get a better focus here on my camera. I have a firsthand experience with organizations, advising them on their internal digital workplace. And I conducted a research survey since 2006, every year until 2016, that I called not the digital workplace at all, but I called it the organization in the digital age, which is quite different. And I began seeing a trend come out at a certain point that made me suddenly shift over to the individual. I saw individual capabilities emerging from the organization in the digital age, such as the capability of people being able to comment openly on the internet. People could build communities, they could participate in networks, they could search for expertise across the organization without knowing people's names. And these were all new things. Yet, these should have enabled fundamental changes in organizations, but in fact, things at a certain level were staying the same. And that's because one of my marker questions I asked every year was, how would you rate the leadership in your organization, referring to the top leadership in this question, between command and control to open and participatory? And the open and participatory segment amount remained pretty stagnated around 20% for several years in a row. And I could see there was a collision beginning to happen between people, what they could do, and what they were able to do in the organization. And so I oriented my research around what I call the gig mindset. I got about 15 people from around the world to participate in my advisory board. We defined 8 traits to examine, to compare a traditional way of working to gig mindset way of working. And so we built up our first survey in 2018 with that idea. The gig mindset refers to people. You can see from links in the article that I published on Founding Fuel, that it's in the mind of the people, they are like gig workers or freelancers, even though they are full-time salaried people inside organizations. It's a concept, it's a mindset. And the work that I do is not a method, it's not a model, it's a way of thinking, a way of changing the way you see yourself and the way you see your organization. So what struck me and really hit me very, very hard, I've been working in this business now for 20, 25 years, was I give big presentations to big conferences and so on. But in 2018, I gave a presentation about the gig mindset in Berlin to a big conference, a few months later in London, and then in Paris, my home base. And each time I talked about the gig mindset, all these people came up to me afterwards and at the coffee break with a personal, emotional reaction I had never, ever triggered in any of my previous 20 years of work. Saying things to me like, "You're the first person to understand me," or "Now I know what I can call myself." Another person said to me, "Now I understand why I have the problems I'm having inside my organization." And so for me, that was a real trigger to develop the research further, to interview people, and eventually to write the book and to start a podcast. So I hope I haven't been too long here, Kavi, but I just wanted to give you that background because it was quite a strong experience for me, what these people had to say to me.
Okay, thank you for that, Jane. Ravi, over to you. You've been in the corporate world and then you've given it up and you've gone on to do various kinds of things in various forms. What are some of the changes? Why should we study change? Let's come to what are some of the changes later. But in your mind, why is it even important for us to study change?
Well, we better study change and, more importantly, learn to adapt to change pretty quickly, because the story of the 21st century is all about how we adapt to the greatest degree of change in human history. So the world will change more in this century than in all of human history. And when so much change gets compressed into a really short period, you essentially have what's called an adaptive challenge, where it becomes a struggle for many of us and also for institutions and societies to cope with so much change. And then, of course, what happens then is there are many casualties and some people don't make it. So if you think about an analogy, a metaphor, every once in a very long time, something huge happens and a lot of the species are unable to adapt and you have a mass extinction. The last time it happened was 65 million years ago when there was an asteroid that hit the Earth, and 99% of all living things died, including dinosaurs. And those that survived were the early ancestors of mammals, and here we are. So what's happening right now, Kavi, is that the world is going through unprecedented change. It's driven by many factors. Technology is one of them. Sociological factors, the fact that we're living so much longer, changing, views on beliefs and identities, all that's changing. And so, it's at every level we're coping to adapt, right? So if you look at society or humanity as a whole, we're saying, look, how do we deal with things like climate change? Okay. Then you come down to a country like India, we're struggling to cope with this pandemic. You take some company or institution, Oh, well, it's trying to figure out how to transform itself to stay alive. At an individual, we're struggling to, find ways to stay relevant, to continue to hold on to some means of economic support, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, if you ask me, what is this all about? It's really about understanding the magnitude of change that we're going through and is ahead of us, and developing mindset, skill sets, strategies to learn to cope with it. So yeah, I'm not sure whether I answered it, but to me, that's what this is all about.
Thank you. I think developing the mindsets, skill sets, and strategies, and that is going to be reading the pitch for us. So thank you very much for working that out very nicely. Santosh, you've been you've donned many hats as well, and you've been a commentator for a long while. You've been observing what's happening. I'm sure you've seen many changes that have happened. What's been like for you to study all the changes that have been happening over all these years?
I think it's really interesting. I think today is the fact that it becomes increasingly apparent that change needs to be looked at in an ecological sort of a sense. I think particularly when you look at the context of business, because historically business has had this peculiar kind of reluctance to acknowledge the fact that it is a part of society. I mean, from the old cliche of the business of business being business, I mean, the idea that business was somehow immune from the larger forces that were sort of transforming the world, I think has given way now. And I think there is an acknowledgement that you need to study change as an ecology. And I think which means really, change takes place as a combination of a lot of factors. There is an interrelationship between seemingly unrelated areas, and it becomes important, therefore, to kind of look at and in some ways synthesize across a large number of diverse areas to try and make sense of change. I mean, today, for instance, if you are discussing the gig mindset, you cannot escape discussing questions of identity. You cannot, the meaning of work and how it is changing, the impact that technology has. What does it mean to be a young person today in today's world? How are our ideas of time changed? I mean, there are so many interrelated ideas that come together. And therefore, unless change is looked at A as a system and B as an ecology, I think that's something that you will always have a fragmented kind of a view of change. I think the other aspect that has been interesting and has become quite clear over the years is that change is not a neat system. It's a system, but it's a complex, often contradictory system. Change doesn't only move in a single direction. There are many parts that actually work against each other. And therefore, to try and make a neat package out of change and to sort of try and, in a very coherent sense, talk about change as if there is some thematic unity necessarily underpinning change can often be a vast simplification. And I think it's important to acknowledge that change, in some senses, there is always a countercurrent to change. There are some, aspects where change cascades and affects far more kind of other variables than just a single variable. So what I find particularly, interesting about change is the fact that the need, therefore, to cast one's net wide, to have a certain the ability to read across a diverse set of texts and shifts that are taking place, and yet to try and discern and make sense of it. And as what Ravi said, so eventually you can answer the question, so what do we do about it? And, how do we tackle it? And how do we sort of, how, in some sense, you have to first make sense of it, which I think is extremely important. And not to do it in a simplistic way, not to do it, one variable at a time, but to actually do it in a systematic way, I think is really the key challenge. Having done so, then to sort of in some ways fashion a response to all that is changing.
Fantastic, because it gives us a perfect segue to get into Jane's research and a little bit of what she's going to talk about very quickly. And I quite liked your idea about it's quite complex. It's an ecosystem. And many times when several things are changing, you don't know what really is that. What are those currents that we are seeing and changing? So the first segment, so to speak, that we'll be working with is what are we seeing? What is shifting? What are we seeing is what is going to be the first segment that we'll work with, where we're going to invite Jane to talk about her research, just one piece at a time, maybe 3-4 pieces, Jane. If you can just lay out one piece, and then we'll have Santosh and Ravi to respond to what they're seeing vis-a-vis whatever is your single piece that you have picked up as an interesting facet of your research. And then we'll try and build up maybe a set of things that the pitch is showing right now on the surface, and then we'll play with it. Over to you again, Jane.
Good. Okay, I'm really curious to see what Ravi and Santosh are going to say about this one. The first one I'd like to start with is the idea of people taking initiatives on their own inside organizations. When they see something that needs to be done, they do it, or they bring together a group of people to handle it without going through the traditional management approval process. And I saw it happen in 2 different large organizations. In one case, the person put up a public Facebook page about a thing they were working on that is actually a global problem. It has to do with a pharmaceutical, an illness, and a potential cure for that they were working on. She put up a Facebook page without asking management. And she was hit hard by management for having done it. But within 48 hours, there were so many people coming online, including competitors, saying, this is a fantastic, great initiative. We want to join and work with you to fight this thing. And I don't want to talk about it in too much specific detail, but her breaking the rule was then validated strongly by the outside world, and she became her image inside the organization rose because of her ability to break that rule. Another case, something similar happened in a large industrial company where a couple people in there, again, put something out in public on, I think it was LinkedIn and Facebook. They were experimenting with the talent management system. And boy, did they get hit by HR for having done it externally instead of internally. And it turned out, without getting permission, and it turned out that both of them left the company, one permanently and the other on a leave of absence for nearly a year. And then he was such a smart guy, he got called back to work on a strategic project. But in the meantime, the reaction of the organization was, no, we can't do this in a visible way. And so the point I'm talking about now is people taking initiatives voluntarily without going through the traditional process. And I'd like very much to know what you guys think, Ravi and Santosh, about how that echoes with what you see.
I'm asking for permission. Who's going first?
After you, Ravi.
No, I think that's right, Jane. But to me, it sounds very much like leadership. You've given it a particular name, gig mindset, but this is the essence to me of what leadership is all about, which is it's not about title, it's not about position, it's not about a formal mandate to go act on something. You just see something that needs to be done, some problem that needs to be fixed, some opportunity, and you don't wait to be told. You don't ask for approval, you don't ask for permission, you just step up and commit yourself to it. And invariably what happens is other people join hands because they've seen the need as well, but we're waiting for leadership. So look, I started out by saying the 21st century is all about change and how we adapt to change. But the flip side of change is leadership, right? So you can't have change without people being, leading it, supporting it, etc. And so if you talk, since bulk of your work is addressed at the level of an organization, a company, or whatever, if you talk to most CEOs today, very few of them will complain about the lack of opportunity. Even fewer will, moan and groan about resources. It turns out that the thing that's in short supply, the scarce resource, are leaders within the organization who are capable of driving change. So if you think about something like digital transformation. Every company is trying to transform itself, become a tech-driven or a tech-enabled company. Who's going to do this work, right? So that's leaders. And if you step beyond organizations and companies and look at society at large, leadership is an even bigger issue. Because if you take COVID, for instance, and India is a particularly good example of this, it's been a real wake-up call. Our public health systems failed. Government more or less abdicated. People with the formal responsibility and authority to deliver things pretty much became scarce or even absconded. And what has saved the day is millions of ordinary people, unknown, unsung people who've stepped in to the breach, and they weren't asked to do things, but they figured out how to deliver oxygen, how to, get help to people, get folks vaccinated, and so on. So it's all about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I think that, as I read your book, that's what came across. And I think that's our biggest hope for the future, which is that there shouldn't be some exceptional small cohort of people who are viewed as deviants and aberrants in organization. This has to become the mainstream. So I think your book and your ideas come at a good time. I think also I would say, Jane, from the perspective of the individual, this is also really important. If pretty soon we may have time to unpack the whole way in which world is changing, the world of work is changing, and what it means for jobs and employment. But to me, the defining skill of the 21st century seems to be around leadership, right? It's what is in the most scarce supply right now. It's likely to be scarcer going forward. You're unlikely to be taken over by a robot or a piece of software if you're a leader. And so, if you were going to flourish in this period of time, if you're going to have an exceptional life and an exceptional career, you need to be developing your leadership mindset and skills, which I think you particularly refer to as the gig mindset. So those are my reactions, but I absolutely would agree with you that this is an important phenomenon. We need to call attention to it, and maybe hopefully in the rest of the hour talk about how do we develop it, particularly from an individual perspective.
Yeah, if I could just react briefly, Ravi, I like very much the way you made the connection between leadership and the gig mindset. For me, the gig mindset is broader than just leadership, but leadership in the way you describe it is a key part of it. In my work, I've defined leadership as leaders are people anywhere in the organization at any level who influence change and can bring impact because of their work. And it's not people at the top. And gig mindsetters can be leaders, or they can be squashed in organizations. And so, again, I have my organizational hat on. And when we look at society at large and how things are developing, we actually see the same thing in society, even in the United States right now in politics. You see a lot of, in theory, people trying to do something different, and they're being squashed also. So I think we have a similar thing going on.
I do.
Anyway, I like to...
I don't want to steal Santosh's time, but I was, as I was reading your book this weekend, preparing for today, there is a fair amount of time you devote to this issue of leaders with the formal authority near the top of the organization, giving space to these gig mindsetters, if you will, to go flourish and do their thing and so forth. It's an issue we should debate, because in my personal experience and seeing lots of others who you would consider having the gig mindset, space is something that you have to take and create. It's rarely given to you on a platter. And very often there'll be pushback and resistance. Like the HR person who reacted poorly to the person posting something out there. That stuff is just part and parcel of the game. And if you're going to be successful as a gig worker inside an organization or a leader anywhere, I think you can't be sort of waiting for fertile conditions. You have to just go grab the space and get on with it. But anyway,
yeah,
it's
absolutely.
good to
grab the space and get on with it, and maybe lose your space. But if you lose your space, then you move on to something else.
Exactly. You may not have space within this context, this organization,
yeah,
but it's a big world out there.
Exactly. Santosh, where are you at on this?
Yeah, so no, I think, I think what this whole very fascinating kind of a conversation, I think the underpinning of it, I think, is the fact that there is a fundamental relationship. And I think historically, we've always thought of the organization as being the sort of mothership, that has all the kind of energy and all the resources located in the organization. And the role of and if you look at the source of wealth, if you go back to the 20th century and look at the source of wealth, very often it is, they are legacy systems. These are the kind of assets that the organization builds over a period of time. You could have a distribution asset, you could have a back-end technology asset, relatively stable businesses, relatively stable market positions, where the role of the individual is limited to performing a certain function. And therefore, the individual as a substitutable resource. And therefore, the idea of the organization, in fact, as the kind of source of energy, and the individual as being components, are playing specific small roles within that larger system. I think over a period of time, that is fundamentally getting challenged. And the source of wealth has shifted from legacy systems to the fact that you need to have ideas. And if you look at if you look at all the new wealth that has been created in the last decade or the last 15 years, all of it is based on ideas. Ideas don't belong to legacy systems. They are embedded in individuals. There is a certain creative energy that needs to be harnessed. So if you look at the whole startup culture, you will find, therefore, it's not the old sort of people who are experienced, but it's the younger people who are coming in who are creating new ideas and new avenues for wealth. So this fundamental redefinition, the idea that people are resources and the organization is what matters. I think this time is coming where we are moving to saying, why should it not be the other way around? Why should the organization not be the resource? And people's ideas coming to the fore. And I think that transition, and it's not an easy transition to make, as evidenced by the fact that every time, what you describe as the gig mindsetters have a new idea, the first instinct of the organization is to resist. Is to say, this is not how it is done, because that it's still steep. So while it may talk the talk about all the new changes and transformation, when it comes to the reality of being challenged, or somebody coming up with something, exercising initiative, the instinct is to restrain. But because the context has changed, that instinct does not always, very quickly, like you realize, like you pointed out, 48 hours, you figure out that actually this is a good idea and this works. And I think the difference between the organization of yesterday and the organization of today is that in spite of that initial instinct of resisting, you do acknowledge the merit of the idea, and you do not insist on the fact that the system must prevail. And I think this renegotiation that is taking place between the individual and the organization, and the kind of roles that are being played by the two, and how, in fact, there is a shift and a transference, if you like, from where is the energy coming from for growth, for new ideas. I think that shift, it's not yet happened fully. It is perhaps in its early stages, but we are beginning to see that shift.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Kavi, can I jump to another point now that fits right in with what Santosh just said?
Maybe you could take 2 points together. Maybe you could have a...
Okay. The second point I had wanted to talk about was the fact that silos need to be broken in organizations. And they're very strong in organizations because they become territories for middle-level managers very often, sometimes senior-level managers. And there's a lot of struggle between silos in organizations. And a guy I met who works for a very big German company, who came to a community that I run, said, you know, Jane, silos are not as bad as you're making them sound. A silo is like a neighborhood, and that I'm at ease in my silo, I'm at ease in my neighborhood. But what people forget is that a neighborhood is part of a city, and a city is part of a country. And it's that extra dimension that gets forgotten. And I think we need to go further today as one, I think, Ravi, one of the two of you mentioned, we need to extend that to the world, to a country's part of the world, as a corporation needs to be part of the world today. And so that's one thing I see in my data, in that working across organizations is something that is not, working across silos, sorry, is something that's not common in most organizations. I'm not going to combine another thing with that. Sorry, Kevi. I just would like to know what Ravi and Santosh think about that from their experience, getting through the silos.
No, I think that's true. I think, you know, the idea of fixed labels to things, the fact that we fix labels to things and we draw rigid boundaries around them. I mean, if you were to just step outside the world of work also, we've seen so many ways traditional boundaries, traditional binaries are being dismantled. The most foundational binaries on which we have grown up, gender, for instance, is a binary that has, instead of it being something that is fixed and something that is given, it is a spectrum of possibilities that today, you know, gender represents. And I think it's fascinating how, therefore, so many of the certitudes of an earlier time, so many of the ideas that a certain a box with a certain fixed label is now giving way. So in terms of work, also in terms of notions of career, what constitutes success, you find, you know, if you look at a lot of the younger people today, their ideas of success are far more, their ambition is far more horizontal than only vertical. Yeah, you know,
yeah,
they
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, they want to be doing several things at the same time. I mean, it's simultaneity and not sequential kind of an ambition. And so I think in a very fundamental way, the idea of these neat divisions, these little boxes that we put our lives into, even the work and life, and as we've seen particularly last year, we've seen, you know, the whole work and life, and the idea, you know, I have always found the notion of work-life balance as an idea ludicrous, because it seems to suggest that work somehow resides outside life, which to my mind is an absurd proposition. But in a very experienced sense, in a lived sense, we have you know, come to a way of living that where the two are kind of intertwined. And again, even those kind of foundational sort of boxes are no longer valid. So I do think that this is part of a much larger shift where silos of all kinds are turning liquid, you know, are turning fluid, are turning into rubber. And I think and it's a very interesting time, therefore, when things bleed into each other.
Yeah, one of the people in my survey was based in Nigeria. He said he was a real estate developer. And in answer to some of my questions, he said, I cannot answer these questions because work is life and life is work. I'm a gig mindsetter, period, whether I'm living or whether I'm working. And he wrote me a long email about that. And I found that was really interesting. Ravi, how do you take this?
I think you're right. Santosh has done an admirable job commenting already. But it also strikes me that there's another aspect of a world that is being forced to become more boundaryless. And that's because the nature of the problems we encounter do not respect boundaries. They transcend boundaries. So, for instance, where I live in Bangalore, one of our big issues is getting the garbage off the streets. There's the whole city's garbage management system is, overextended, and so a bunch of us citizens get together and we try and take this problem on. And it might seem like a relatively simple problem, but it turns out to be not. And in order to make this work, you actually have to get citizens, government, companies all working together. So forget silos within an organization. You have to get all parts of society working together. If you try to do something within a company today, start a new business, launch a new product, transform some process digitally. You have to go horizontally. So, I think the change is happening orthogonally to the way we are organized. And therefore, the idea is that we have to become much more boundaryless. The good thing is that a lot of people are. Okay, I think the idea of silos, boundaries, functions within which you live and flourish is 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 conditioned into us, as in by these organizations. It's not necessarily a natural way for human beings to operate and think and so forth. So I'm quite hopeful that younger people, the younger generation that hasn't been conditioned this way, is going to be far more boundaryless in its thinking, as Santosh has already commented, and I saw you agree. I think they're also more horizontal in their definition of success. So that helps too.
I'd like to know how the two of you, one of the points I was going to raise later was the difficulties of challenging the status quo. And one of my survey questions that absolutely shocked me was, the question was, what criteria do you look for when you hire new people? And I won't read the whole chart to you, but the number one criteria that 98% of the people said they look for is knowledge and skills. Further down the list, we have the ability to offer alternative opinions and to challenge assumptions. 28% of the organization said they looked for that. And I think, well, my question to you is, how can organizations identify these people who dare to challenge, who want to bring change when they're being hired? What can they do?
I'd love to take that on, because some years ago, I was handed a large challenge. I became the chairman of a public sector bank, a large public sector bank, which needed a lot of change. And the problem was, you have 54,000 people, and you can't tell who's really a capable leader and who isn't. One of my predecessors is also on the call. He's a very well-known public sector banker, Dr. Khandelwal, so he'll appreciate particularly what I'm saying. And when we looked at the performance evaluation system, Jane, we could tell nothing, because the difference between a high performer and a low performer was very modest. And mostly the metrics of performance were all wrong. They were about loyalty, getting along with the boss, and so forth, rather than people who could deliver outcomes and so forth. So we had to do enormously complicated process of running 5,400 people through assessment centers and so forth. And then we came up with a small number of them that we said have leadership potential based on psychometric questions and so forth. And then we started giving them challenges and said, look, how did they respond to challenges? Eventually, it turned out that 0.5% of the people actually had excellent leadership potential and capabilities. And by the way, these were not always the people seen by management as high potential leaders. Okay, so a lot of these people who are capable of creating great value in organizations, driving transformation, etc., turn out to be, difficult people. They're not the easiest to manage. They're not always willing to conform and get along and so forth. They're prickly, angular, but those are some of the very qualities that make them so successful. So one of the questions I learned to ask as I've been involved in hiring, promoting decisions, is looking at where an individual has shown initiative in taking on some big problem, some big challenge. It could be at work, it could be outside of work. How did they deal with some circumstance that they were dealt with? For instance, the loss of a parent early in life or something like that. And how did they cope with it, and how did they grow in the process? How did they deal with failure, not just success? So I think these kinds of questions are far more helpful and indicative of the leadership qualities that we are referring to.
Yes, that's good. One person I interviewed told me that when they interview people, they ask the person, how big is your external network? They don't ask to see the network. That would not be correct. You couldn't do that, at least in Europe, you couldn't do that. But simply, do you have a network on Facebook? Do you have a network on LinkedIn or whatever? And how many connections do you have? Because they figured the people who had the most connections were most likely to be the people who had a better view of what was going on externally around the company.
I'm slightly worried about that question.
Sorry?
I said I'm slightly worried about the question. I get what you're getting at in terms of having broad networks, professional and otherwise. But at the same time, there's a tendency these days to, be towards self-promotion and just mindless networking. As long as you filter out that aspect, I think your point is a terrific one.
I'm going to go back to the guy and ask him how he does that. I think your objection is very good. Kathy, are we getting
Yes, if you're getting a lot, I'm having difficulty here just keeping pace with all the comments that are coming up. I have one particular comment which is here, which I just want to throw at any of you would probably take it up. Big Ray says, I see organizations seem to put higher focus on minimizing costs rather than improving operations or growth. This is perhaps stifling ideas. That's my observation. That's what he says. Maybe one of those avenues is a focus on costs, and maybe that's what's coming in the way, is one of the observations. So any of you would want to take it before we move to the next segment? Is it an over-dependence on cost? Focus on costs?
I guess we're maybe with companies that are held by shareholders and therefore concerned about their results at the end of each quarter, possibly.
Look,
I don't know. What do you think, Ravi and Santosh?
I wanted to give Santosh space first. If you won't take it, then I'll do it.
Ravi, please. I'd like to respond to what you have.
So look, I'm not sure that I would necessarily conflate the two so directly, although there are, these frugal environments tend to suppress talent and the human spirit and ideas a lot. But the real distinction is whether you value the minds of people, okay? Or you want essentially arms and legs who will be compliant and do as told, right? If you have a company philosophy or value system which doesn't encourage the human spirit and initiative and imagination, then that's the real problem. I think the reality of every business today is you have to continuously be working on your costs and cost structure. And that's just a requirement to stay alive. That is, in my experience, not necessarily correlated with having, crushing the human spirit. So I've worked with a number of companies, and one of the most particularly sort of cost-conscious companies I know is a British company called JCP. They make backhoes and construction machinery. And that company is privately held and very, very cost-conscious and frugal. But they seem to hold this dichotomy pretty well, which is also encouraging everybody to contribute ideas. You can be a frontline worker running a machine or operating a piece of equipment, and there's a sort of way for you to contribute ideas, and you can do that if you're an engineer or a manager or whatever. So I think it's more a distinction between philosophy and this is this whole James McGregor theory X versus theory Y of human behavior, more than necessarily a cost consciousness.
It's interesting you refer to him because I list him. I think he's number one on my list in an appendix of the book. Maybe you noticed that. He a pioneer of the gig mindset. He was number one on the list, chronologically speaking.
I missed that. but I think his work remains sensational 50 years later.
Absolutely. And he's not well known, not in the corporate world I live in. People don't know him.
Right. Now, you take a company like Toyota, which is extraordinarily focused on excellence and efficiency and continuous improvement. But their philosophy is, not inconsistent with human beings showing, great initiative, leadership, etc. You don't have to be a machine to fit in. So, yeah, I think it's possible.
Okay, thank you. I think it's perfect time, and it's great to segue into section 2, which is what seem to be some underpinnings of this change for you. What's causing all this change? And we'll spend slightly lesser time here, but we'll quickly then move on to, therefore, what should we do? But it's important for us to also think about what are some underpinnings, what are some stuff that holds this up. If what we've discussed is on the surface, what's beneath the surface? So I would request Santosh to open up this time, open the innings, so to speak. From your observations, what do you see?
No, clearly, I mean, as I think Ravi also pointed out, I think Jane also mentioned, I mean, this is a time of tremendous change across so many different frontiers. And I think some of our fundamental concepts have changed. And I think, obviously, technology has played a huge role. And in many ways, I believe that, just the idea of a mobile phone and a smartphone, it changes every individual's relationship with the world and forces them to define themselves in a new way. I mean, it's an extraordinary, if you just think about this device that you hold, that virtually, every individual today has access to, which is this powerful kind of a compendium of capabilities that you have, both in terms of connecting to whoever you wish to, in terms of reaching out, and the idea of the world getting collapsed to you. I think what it does, and apart from everything else, which I think at a most foundational level, what it does is that it makes you experience the sense of being an individual in a fully realized way, which you never have done before. Because, this is your personal kind of a device to deal with the world. And therefore, it forces every individual to define their individuality. The fact that there is this compulsion to take selfies, for instance, is just, if you think about the selfie, it is in a sense you are beta testing yourself all the time. It's a rapid prototyping of the self that you're doing every minute of the day, virtually so it would seem, where you are trying to find a version of yourself that works. And the idea, therefore, of a fixed reality, of a fixed sense of identity, is giving way to multiple fluid sense of an identity. And I think just the very foundational idea of identity is getting transformed. So if you look at, say, you look at an Instagram profile, if you look at a Twitter profile of people today, they define themselves in multiple ways. The idea that I am A and B and C simultaneously, that I wish to do so many different things with my life. I'm a foodie at one level, I ride bikes, and I collect vintage sort of matchbox labels maybe. It's fascinating how the idea of a vertical, gradual sort of a progression, a script of a life, which was an ascending singular curve that you were hoping to sort of achieve, has given way to this fragmented, multiple sort of script that you write for yourself. And as a result, concepts of all kinds have become fluid. I mean, the notion of streaming is again about something fixed turning into something liquid. The idea of usership giving way, taking over from ownership. Why should I have the notion of a fixed something, a set of capabilities that I must keep with me? Why not only utilize the facility when I need it? Right? So it's fascinating how that has changed. Careers, similarly, the idea of a single idea of a career, which again is a sort of a curve which has a shape, increasingly getting fragmented into pursuing several projects, one after the other, sometimes simultaneously. And I think all of it is being driven by the fact that the individual is at the seat and is defining, what do I want? What do I feel like doing? What are the several things I want to do at the same time? And driven by the individual rather than by social norms that are dictating how your life should be lived. As the individual tends to sort of define his or her life and his or her script, I think this is a foundational and a fundamental shift that we are beginning to see. And I think I mean there are many more dimensions to this, but to my mind, I think let me just keep it here, and I'd love to hear the others, and then we can carry the conversation forward.
Thank you, Santosh. Ravi?
No, I think Santosh has got us started off very strongly. There are probably a couple of more trends which I would add to that, because as he pointed out, it's not one thing, it's many things coming together. Well, one of the things that's happening is that the nature of work is changing. This idea that you have a job and you see yourself as an employee and your identity is very largely around your work, and you have a career which is like, you enter a tunnel and emerge 40 years later into retirement, is almost gone. It's almost obsolete. First of all, there are fewer jobs than there are people who want work. And that gap is going to be quite large for some period of time in many parts of the world. The second is there's no such thing as job security, because companies have become incredibly short-term and transactional. They're also going through all kinds of disruptions and challenges of their own. So you could be a well-performing person in a company, and tomorrow the music stops and you have no chair. And so I think not just by choice, but by compulsion, more and more of us are having to learn to become freelancers, where you may spend some time with a company, but life more realistically, as Santosh has already said, resembles a series of projects. And sometimes it's a portfolio of projects. And that portfolio of projects gives you different things. It gives you money. Some of your projects are paid. Others are pro bono. Some things give you joy. Some things you do because you enjoy learning. So thinking about life not as a freelancer, as a series and portfolio of projects, and careers more like S-curves rather than climbing a ladder. This shift is enormous, and it's not one that is necessarily by choice so much as being forced onto lots and lots of people. So back to one of the quibbles I have with Jane's framing. It's not just some people who have a gig mindset. I think very soon we're all going to be forced to develop this gig mindset. Otherwise, life's going to be pretty hard. And another giant trend is just longevity. The fact that more and more of us will live into our 90s, I think has profound consequences that many people haven't thought through. We used to live what Linda Grattan calls a 3-stage life. You spend 20 years learning, 40 years earning, and then another 10, 15 years enjoying retirement, and then you're gone. Now you live 100 years. And what it means is most of us will have to work till you're at least 75, 80 out of financial necessity. In that period of time, you're going to have to be a lifelong student, because whatever you know is obsolete every 5, 10 years. So learning is also lifelong. And somewhere in there, you better layer in the things you want to do to have fun and make life meaningful. So what does that mean? It means that, again, this trend is going to drive many of us to freelancing and gig work and gig mindset. So it turns out yesterday, my good old colleague who was at Microsoft, he was the number 2. His name is Jean-Philippe Courtois, finally retired from the company after 37 years. And he's all of 60 years old. And he spent nearly 40 of that at Microsoft. He's done rather well financially. But suddenly he's 60. He's got another 20, 25 years ahead of him. Sure, he doesn't need to work for money, but he's got to figure out what he has to do. Guess what? Overnight, he has to become a freelancer, a gig worker, just like many of us, albeit with a better balance sheet. So I think these two trends are also important in addition to the shifting sense of identity and what people are looking for out of life and so on that Santosh has so admirably described.
Thank you. It kind of sets the ball perfect for Jane. What does research say? What does your research say?
I just wanted to add the fact that I didn't mean to give the impression, Ravi, that we would not all eventually become more gig mindset in the way we work, because I think the way we live, let me put it that way, because I think we need to. I think it raises fundamental questions about income. What do you use to pay the rent? What is your health coverage? And without going into detail about the situation in India that I only read about in the papers, I know firsthand what it's like in America, because my son lives and works in Los Angeles, and he communicates a lot to me about his friends and the precautions they have to take, and so on and so on. And so there's a reality of, I think you said, Ravi, that we will all need to put together different ways of working, sometimes as freelancers, sometimes pro bono, et cetera, but we do all need a way to eat and a place to sleep and to have fun and to experience leisure. And I think there's something pretty interesting behind the idea of a universal basic income that may enable people to develop themselves in ways that are better for themselves and for society.
Hey, Jane, thank you for that. I was merely trying to create some sparks and energy in the conversation.
You did that.
I know where you're coming from, and I think we're far more aligned in our thinking than different. But it's good to stir the pot in these kinds of big discussions.
Okay, so we have a question here before we segue into the next segment, which is Meenal asks a question: are leaders feeling a lack of control, and that is pushing towards a resistance towards change? The definition of power and control is being questioned. Any comments from any of you?
Well, my first instinctive reaction is she's doing what most people do, which is confusing position and title with leadership. So, implicit in your question, Meenal, is that these are people at the, higher levels of the organization. You're calling them leaders. They're feeling a loss of control and so on and so forth. First of all, most of those people are anything but leaders. Okay, they simply have the title. But in fact, they got there by, being safe, playing politics, not rocking the boat, being consistent, and so on and so forth. And yes, in too many organizations, the people in the higher levels have got there by wanting things to be more predictable and therefore being very control-oriented. And I think this shift that we're all trying to describe and talk about is enormously discomforting to them. Okay, Santosh used the word liquid, and that's a very apt metaphor. Everything is solid is turning liquid, and they don't know how to deal with it. And the instinctive, visceral reaction is, let's try and control things more. But of course, that makes things worse. Unfortunately, I don't think the future is very bright for a lot of these folks, because either they will become history because they couldn't adapt to, or their organizations are going to become history because they didn't let go of these people soon enough. So, yeah, but what you're describing, though, is a very fundamental issue called resistance to change.
I think a lot of those people live in filter bubbles. They
live
in their own little comfort zone. Their own little comfort zone. It used to be on the top of a building. Now maybe it's in their own home office. But the point is, they're not exposed enough. I don't want to defend them, but they're not exposed enough to the edges of the organization, to what's really going on in the world. And it's their own fault. It's what we could call willful blindness. And we can't Willful blindness is actually a judicial term, meaning you claim that you didn't see or know something willfully in order to avoid responsibility for it. And I think a lot of leaders are guilty of that.
Well, I also think that, in some ways, the mental model of the organization itself. I mean, if you look at historically, the organization with its in the military and its understanding of and therefore the idea of converting all units of work into predictable, homogeneous, disciplined, obedient units, which conform to direction, and that you try and in fact take therefore disparate individuals and sort of cobble them together into predictable shapes and then point them in a certain direction in order to get a certain result. I mean, that has traditionally been the operating mental model of organizations. Now, the problem is that the context today has changed dramatically, and that kind of a mental model has very little value today. I mean, you do need a certain amount of order, but largely, given the volatility of the context, given the fact that opportunities are arising in new places, that new kind of concepts are being created every day, that kind of an idea of a centralized control, which moves in predictable, orderly, small steps, is utterly archaic. And I think that is the pressure that is being felt by, again, legacy mindsets that are, where the context, while in spite of the fact that the context has changed, still continuing with a certain mental model that is now outdated.
Fantastic. That's a great segue for us to go into section 3.
Is that the third innings or is it something else?
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Ravi.
You didn't use a cricket metaphor. You didn't say the next innings.
These are the final overs. We're getting into the final overs.
Wonderful.
So we're getting into, so what? Okay, so what should we do? How should we prepare? And if from your world, from your purchase, so to speak, what are some of the prescriptions and advice, if it were for all of us, just for us to understand what should we do? So over to you, whoever wants to pick the ball up.
Well, I'll start with something that I think I've seen a lot of in my work as an advisor, and that is, I'm sure everyone has seen it, these huge, big change programs that last for years that fail, probably 90% of the time. And I think that inside organizations, people need to accept the fact that change is going to happen step by step, nudge by nudge, in a persistent way. I think that's the way you need to think about it happening, not necessarily by big, dramatic changes. That's one thing I wanted to mention. And another thing I think is really important is that people need to find ways of attracting the right people to join the organization. The people who want to bring about change, the gig mindsetters, if I can call them that. And I think that's a challenge for a lot of organizations because it does not fit the current HR or typical HR process for hiring people, interviewing people, and evaluating people, and so on. So over to you, Santosh and Ravi.
So, Santosh, do you want to go first? Or?
You say.
Look, you address this at different levels, right? I think the most important is what can you do for yourself to strengthen the so-called gig mindset and develop, as I said at the beginning, the mindset, the skills, and the strategies to flourish in so much change. And, as I was reading your book, Jane, I was also struck by interesting and important parallels with Carol Dweck's ideas and the growth mindset. They're not very different. And I think you have to make sure that you are driven by interest in taking on new challenges, stretching yourself, learning new things, and willing to constantly put yourself outside your comfort zone. So it turns out the way this, you develop this muscle, the gig mindset or anything like that is basically a muscle which gets stronger the more you exercise it. So the more, the first time you take on some little problem that without somebody asking you to, without you asking for a permission, you just do it, and there's a good feeling. You grow in your self-confidence, and then you are able to take on something bigger and bigger and bigger, and so on and so forth. So this journey has to start with taking on, progressively bigger and newer challenges. The second thing is you should take on challenges that are different, not just more of the same. So since we're talking about being in a company and all that, move to a different function, move to a different country, do something very different. So do lots of different things, change industry now and then. These things radically shape, you both develop your muscles as well shape your perspective. I think one of the most important things that all of us can do to strengthen our leadership skills, our gig mindset, all that, is take on projects in the community. So right now in particular is a fabulous time because the community just has so many desperate needs and related to the pandemic and its consequences. But this turns out to be one of the best ways because you have to lead by influence. Nobody reports to you. Nobody cares who you are. They are willing to do something with you because they think you're trying to do the right thing. So you learn real leadership. You learn how to work with people who are dramatically different from you to get things done. You learn problem solving. So anyway, there's a set of things you can do at an individual level. Then, of course, I think companies, the country at large, we all have to do very different things to allow more such people to flourish. And so here's, one of the most interesting things I do these days is my work with UNICEF. And in particular in India, we have started a new mission called Young Warriors, Young COVID Warriors. We're trying to say, how do we get millions of young people, instead of feeling anxious, depressed, they're not able to go to school, their education is truncated, there's loss around them. How do we get them to, in this environment, step up and show leadership? So we've launched this mission. Our aim is to mobilize 5 million young people to go out just in their own vicinity, around their home, with their families, their friends, their immediate neighbors. Find a way to help 10 people around you. And it could be small things like getting them enrolled for vaccination in the app, or getting somebody access to oxygen, or combating some disinformation. And so the idea is, by doing this, they develop a sense of agency, they develop a sense of self-worth, self-confidence, and some skills. So we're trying to do this at a massive, massive scale. We're trying to do this in my work with entrepreneurship, where one of the most fascinating things is our work with about nearly 1 million school children in Delhi schools, class 8 to 12. And these are from all government schools, from the most gritty socioeconomic backgrounds. But we teach them entrepreneurship, where they have to learn by doing. They have to actually launch a business by getting into teams. And you see that it's absolutely transformational. And Jane, if you were to meet them, you'd say they've got the gig mindset. They're leaders. So I think there are a lot of interventions which are possible societally at the level of an institution. But what interests me most is what we can do ourselves as individuals.
I'm sure that, Ravi, you're familiar with Albert Ventura and the social learning theory. And I think that's relevant to what you're talking about, where people build up a sense of self-efficacy, what they are capable of doing in spite of difficulties, and how they continue doing it. And you say they, move in different directions for their challenges. And then just to go back to my research for just one little second, one of the questions over the years is what drives change the most in your organization? And every time it's behavior of leaders, behavior of colleagues, and behavior of line managers. It's always behaviors of other people in the organization that drives our change. That's back to the organizational context. And I think what you're doing with the children is fantastic. That really sounds interesting and valuable.
Yeah, and I'll just add one last thing before I cede space. As I told you, one of my transformational experiences personally was working at this public sector bank. And there wasn't much you could do by way of incentives and things like that to motivate performance. In fact, there was a lot of disincentives for people to take risks and really perform. But through our leadership assessment and development program, we eventually identified a few hundred people across the organization at different levels, lower levels, middle levels, upper levels, who had what you call the gig mindset. And simply by knowing who they were and gradually moving them to the positions or roles that really mattered, we got an amazing change in the performance of the organization. So this has huge implications for companies, which is who do you promote into the positions that really matter? What behaviors are held up as, successful, etc. So we've got to change all these things quite consciously and very, very fast if you're going to be successful.
Interesting.
Santosh.
A couple of, I think, some very very rich conversation has already happened. A couple of small things that come to mind. One is that, at the level of the individual, I think one of the things that is becoming increasingly important is what is the degree of uniqueness? What makes you unique? What makes you you? I mean, I think increasingly, because at the seat of and as the engine of whether you look at gig mind setting or whether you look at just the idea of what drives change and innovation, is what the individual uniquely can bring to the table. And I think this idea that there is something that you are capable of sort of adding, which is not just about your education. It is not just about a few skills, but particularly in a fluid world where what you might be doing today might be very different from what you're doing tomorrow. It's important to bring all of yourself and the many parts of yourself you need to deploy in order to actually get the greatest amount of value from yourself. And I think that the idea of an earlier time where you implicitly, particularly in the early years, were focused on conforming, learning how the world works, learning how the system works, and finding a way to fit in, and then moving ahead. As against that, the idea that that what is valuable is the difference that you make, is not what is similar, but what makes you different. What makes it possible for you and your ideas to be valued in a context where you work with a diverse set of people and you are able to add something of yourself. And I think one part of it, which I think Ravi has already mentioned, but I think which is very significant, is the fact that the idea of continuously learning, I think it's not just about being open to learning, which I think is extremely important, but I think systemically, we are still, structured in a way that we have 20 years of education, after which it is now left to the individual to sort of figure out and learn. The system itself, I think, needs to change, because the idea of a one-time injection, a very big, large injection, of education, 80% of which you have forgotten by the time you emerge from that pipeline, that is meant to last you for a lifetime, is an anachronistic idea. Unless that is radically reformulated, for it to be available at different points of time in one's life, in a coherent, in an organized way, at least more organized than what it is right now. I think without that shift taking place, I think a lot of what we are talking about will be difficult for that to come about. So I think that's the other fundamental shift that I think needs to be made if we are indeed going to go further down this road.
Would you agree, Santosh, that people need to think in terms of, imagine that my job doesn't exist tomorrow. Imagine that my organization no longer exists. What am I? What do I do? What can I do? Do you think that helps people focus back on their selves?
I think that certainly is an interesting way of framing it. But I also think that at the outset, the idea that if in some ways, how we think of ourselves and how we describe ourselves, very often it happens through, I am educated in a certain way. I bring a certain skill set. And I find it interesting, just like in our lives, we are able to now describe ourselves in so many diverse ways that we want to do so. We don't describe ourselves as I'm only a banker. I don't. Very few people on social media will say that I'm a banker from an Ivy League school. That would be so pathetically boring. If people were to describe it like that, you have to say that you are 8 different things. But when you in the workplace, however, it's still you kind of in some ways distill your self description into 1 or 2 kind of skill sets, and I think we start describing ourselves in a much more diverse way, and then what you suggest is a good way of sort of asking yourself that question. But I think in a fundamental sense, the self definition needs to change.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it, to close on, Kavi?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of identity and how we see ourselves. And once that starts shifting, many other things will start shifting. There's a beautiful comment from Ajay, which goes like, a learning plan does not have to be a course. I think a learning plan is a series of experiments, meeting innovative people, structured learning, maybe some coaching. Bring it into your life? ? That's the comment over there. I just thought I should just builds on what Santosh was speaking about why should it be so loaded up in front and after that a series of experiences. I just wanted to pose one question to all of you for you to think about. How much does the role of reflection on one's experiences, how much does that merit attention in this fast-paced times?
To what extent is it important or not to reflect on your past experiences? Is that what you're asking?
And current experiences as well.
So how important is the act of reflecting, thinking?
Yes.
That's a new one.
Well, if I may, I mean, I think it is vital. I think it is vital. I think it's not just important to reflect on the past, but I think it's very important to theorize the present. I think it's very important, in a sense, to constantly, and that theory is not a given. It's a fluid theory. It's about sense making of any kind. Is about always trying to, in some senses, and I think I think in the workspace the word theory has a bad rap. Because we always sort of privilege practice over theory. But I think it's extremely important, if we are living in a volatile world where so many things are changing around us, unless we are able to theorize the present, unless we are able to try and make sense of the present as it happens, and with the full knowledge that this is partial, it is incomplete, it is subject to change, it will almost certainly, in many cases, get reversed, whatever our current understanding is. But without that mode of reflection, we are constantly reacting. We are constantly catching up with what is happening in the world. And very often we are late, and by definition, virtually we are late, because of the fact that we are waiting for other people to do the sense making and to give us neat capsules of wisdom. Whereas I think that is a responsibility that each one of us has.
And so we need to have the skill of being able to step back from what we're doing and think. And with the pressure today of the speed at which things change, it's a unique discipline to know how to do that. I don't think most people can do that. Am I being too pessimistic?
No, I think when you go from project to project, when you have that kind of a mindset, I think it's also vital for you to be able to kind of soak in the learnings from a particular project, and when you go into a new experience, draw in from the lessons and learnings from the earlier experience as well. So that's from where I was coming in and asking you that question. Anyway, we are almost there. The last over for you, Ravi. Specifically, top 3 things we should be doing in this time.
Top 3 things we should be doing. I would say that one thing is very practical, which is constantly trying to refresh yourself, renew yourself by taking on bigger, newer, different challenges that also exposes you to new people, new networks. And so you continuously broadening yourself, opening up your definition of what is success, etc. I do think in this age, things are very confusing. And so I have found it personally very important to recalibrate what success means, and to have a more internally sound definition of success rather than caring much about what other people think or may not think. I think that tends to be quite important. I also think where everything around you is so fluid and frankly collapsing right now, I think developing a strong spiritual life is very important. It's like your GPS or compass or whatever it is you want to talk about. So to me, these are some of the things, and your community around you is eventually all that you have. So this has very little to do with necessarily directly with the gig mindset, although Jane may or may not find some connection. But I just think these are very, very important and useful. I found them very useful in these times.
Thank you, Ravi. Santosh, what are your top three?
Well, one thing that I think we've covered that ground, but I think it's very important to avoid fixed labels. I think that it really stultifies our thinking when we attach labels to ideas. And I think I find it ironic that we've talked about fluidity, we've talked about fragmentation, and yet if you were to look at another world, if you look at say politics today, there's such polarization, and all of us go by such fixed labels. And I think this is so limiting, and it's so important to sort of try and break out of the kind of this kind of fixed and very limited kind of therefore the ways of limiting our imagination. I think in a world of today, if we are not fluid, if we do not have the ability to move freely across different domains, and sort of cast a net wide for ideas, I think we will forever be in a trap. And therefore, to me, that is very important. The other is as a corollary, virtually the idea that be open to influences of all kinds. And I think it's really important that inspiration and ideation comes from all spheres of life. And therefore, the more diverse our interests, the more sort of wells that we are drawing from, the richer our ideas. And I think it's really important, therefore, to sort of do that. And I think again, as an extension of that, the idea that it's really important to be able to work with and empathize. And I think with a diverse set of people. And empathy, I think, is something that is a foundational value today. The ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others, the ability for us to connect with people, wherever they might be, to make sense of their context and to respond to them with empathy, I think is the foundational skill tomorrow. If we need to work across diverse groups, if we need to collaborate, which is what we will need to do, without the starting point, which is a basic sort of a honesty in terms of empathizing with people, and having the humility in that sense to acknowledge that our people come from different perspectives. I think without that, it would be impossible to do that. So I would say these three things.
Thank you, Santosh. And Jane, last words.
I'm just going to say one thing, because I've been inspired by what you both have said, Ravi and Santosh. And I want to share with you the direction that my thoughts have been taking for about a month now. And you triggered it, Ravi, when you talked about having some sort of spiritual life, an inner spiritual life. And I've been struck by several things I've read about Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, among others. And the fact that stoicism is much more than I realize. It's not just being stoic, no emotion, etc. There's a whole relationship between you and others, and there's a lot to be developed there. And I feel like I feel like intuitively, I feel like there's a connection I need to think out between when I talk about the gig mindset way of living and stoicism. And so that's sort of, I would say, an early alert to the direction my thinking is going right now.
Thank you. And that completes our pitch report, so to speak. It's left to players out there to decide on how they'll play the match ahead. But it's been a fantastic reading. At least been so fascinating to look at the same pitch from different angles. It's 8 o'clock, and over to you, Ajit.
Thank you, Kavi. I mean, I'd kind of mentioned to, I think, Jane about an hour before this conversation that this will be a special one. And believe me, I mean, I think it's been a scintillating conversation. So thank you to all the three panelists. But we'd love to get some feedback from the participants as well. So if you want to tap in your responses in the chat box, like Charles has already asked you to, that'll be wonderful to just get a feel of how this has gone down. For me, I mean, there is so much to, I think, take away. And I think I'll love to go back to this conversation again later tonight and listen to it again, because there's so much packed into it. In fact, while listening to it, I was kind of reminded of that 1997 work that Shumantra Ghoshal and Christopher Bartlett had done. Many of you will remember the individualized corporation, which for the first time suggested that our corporate structures and modes were completely outmoded. And now here in 2021, we're talking about the individual in some ways stretching their muscles, to quote Ravi, and breaking out and doing things differently, sometimes within the organization, and sometimes if things didn't work out outside. And I think the whole idea of the human spirit that we spoke about to help it reach its full potential was fascinating. And trying to write a new script really for each one of us is a fascinating concept that we'll have to mull over. This brings us to the end of this masterclass, but I think the material that has emerged over the last 1 month is very, very rich and fascinating. So if you haven't had a chance to go through all of it, I think this is a great time to do it, because I'm sure this conversation would have whetted your appetite as well. So really thank you for all the comments that are pouring in. And I think, Anmol, if you can pan on the panel as well, I think they deserve all the kudos. Ravi, Santosh, Jane, and of course, steered by our dear friend Kavi as well. So it's been fascinating to have all of you. So big thank you to Jane, Kavi, Santosh, and Ravi as well for sharing your perspectives, and to the audience for joining us today, and for some of the incredible comments that have come in, which we will hope to pick up on the LinkedIn group that's been formed. Jane has promised to keep the conversation going, and that we believe is the best way to go. So thank you so much, and have a great week ahead. Thank you. Bye.
Well, thank both of you at Founding Fuel for all your work organizing this. It's been really inspiring.
Thank you.
So much.